1,000 years. No funeral bell was rung. No smoke, no flames. No farewell, no closing statement of an era. And yet, when the world finally awoke, power had changed hands. This was the period from 476 AD, when a boy named Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, was overthrown, until the dawn of the Renaissance. A span of time historians now call the Dark Ages. But dark, why? Because of war, bloodshed, disaster? No. Ironically, what makes it dark is not what we see, but what we don't. An unexplainable void. No major inventions. No grand architectural feats. No significant records in science or astronomy. Not even memorable wars to mark the passing centuries. An entire continent, Europe, once the birthplace of Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, and the world's oldest universities, seemed to have entered a millennium-long slumber. And then, when it finally stirred awake, the torch of ancient wisdom was no longer in the hands of those in togas, but of those in white robes. If you've studied history in school, you've probably read lines like, "After Rome fell, Europe descended into chaos, superstition, and decline." But have you ever stopped to question? Question what? Whether that chaos really left behind nothing? Whether an entire civilization didn't just fall, but was erased from memory? Look east. While Europe was said to have been lost in darkness and superstition, the rest of the world kept turning, and turning fast. In China's Tang dynasty, printing technology was invented, musical instruments refined, and poetry and calligraphy flourished. In the Islamic world, Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations for algebra, public hospitals were established, and the Library of Baghdad held hundreds of thousands of ancient manuscripts. In India, the concept of zero, square roots, and advanced Vedic astronomy continued to evolve. Meanwhile, Europe, the land that gave us Socrates, Cicero, and Archimedes, fell silent. You might say, because of war, barbarian invasions by the Visigoths and Huns, plagues. But history has never responded to crisis with total silence. Quite the opposite, the more turbulent the times, the more humans tend to write, draw, and record their existence. But here, from the 5th to the 10th century, it's as if a veil was drawn across the continent. Not a curtain of darkness, but a fog that filtered the light. If you examine the records from this era, you'll notice something strange. They all begin to sound eerily alike. Brief notations, often written by monks. No more Roman scholars. No more Greek historians. No mathematicians, no astronomers, no philosophers. Only fragmented Latin. Church Latin. And only one institution seemed immune to the fog of time. The Vatican. That's the central paradox. While the rest of the world moved, Europe stood still. And in that stillness, the Vatican didn't just survive. It became the sole keeper of the light. But that light, was it to illuminate the path forward? Or to obscure everything that came before? Modern history teaches us that truth is found in evidence, in records, artifacts, celestial patterns. But what if everything we have came only from those allowed to write? Are we remembering the past? Or reciting a script already prepared for us? The first question of this video is not, what happened during the Dark Ages? It's, who didn't want you to know what happened? Let's begin with that question. Part 1, The Silent Death of the Roman Empire. The year was 476 AD. A boy, still not of age, Romulus Augustulus, was quietly dethroned by a barbarian general named Odoacer. There was no grand execution. No climactic battle. No flames engulfing the capital like when Babylon fell. No trumpet blown in mourning. No flags flown at half-mast for a civilization that had once reached the heights of intellect, engineering, military might, and art. And most disturbingly, no one wrote down what really happened. We are talking about an empire that once stretched from Britain to Egypt. A vast system powered by law, commerce, roads, and science. An empire that once held the Library of Alexandria, and built public bathhouses with plumbing more advanced than many modern cities. And then, it vanished. As if it had never existed. Something doesn't add up. Something doesn't make sense. You can burn books. You can kill people. But you cannot erase the traces of an entire civilization. Unless someone intended to do exactly that. The deposition of Romulus should have been an earth-shaking event, like the fall of Constantinople, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, or Hiroshima's instant devastation. But in 476, most people living at the time didn't even realize an empire had just died. Even the monks who wrote about it later only described it as a quiet transition. No protests. No grief. No funeral. And that's precisely what makes it suspicious. Rome didn't die like other empires, it simply faded from collective memory. Was this a natural death? Or a carefully disguised assassination of memory? Imagine living in 476. One day, you are a citizen of Rome, a subject of a 1,000-year-old empire. The next day, the emperor's statue is taken down. The guards wear different uniforms. New laws are announced. And no one reacts. No one asks questions. Not because they didn't care. But perhaps because they were not allowed to care. Not allowed to write. Not allowed to remember. We know of the fall of Troy through epic poetry. We know of Genghis Khan's destruction through the accounts of his enemies. We know of the Great Flood, of Athens at war, of the rise of Islam, because those who lived through it left their stories behind. But Rome? When it fell, it seemed to take the pens of its people down with it. No journals. No memoirs. No detailed chronicles from eyewitnesses. Only silence. That silence is what first caused independent historians to stop and ask. Why did a record-keeping machine like Rome, with its hundreds of libraries, lawyers, and scholars, leave no parting words? Why would a society capable of building bridges over the Rhine and tracking solar calendars down to the day not write a single reliable line about its own collapse? Or did someone write it down, only for someone else to erase it? And if that's true, the next question becomes, who had the power to erase a piece of Europe's collective memory? Certainly not the barbarian tribes. They did not read, did not write, did not archive. They were merely the excuse. The executioners were visible. But those who gave the order remained in the shadows. In the chaotic years following 476, only one force rose in strength and endured. The Roman Christian Church, later known as the Vatican. As city-states crumbled and barbarian armies took over Roman lands, people still needed somewhere to look for stability. And that place was not the courts, not the state, but the church. It's no coincidence that after the empire's fall, people stopped remembering kings, but never forgot the names of the popes. So let us pause and ask ourselves, was Rome never buried? Or was it not allowed to be buried? This is not a conclusion. We are not claiming the Vatican orchestrated it all. But we are following the footprints. And they all seem to point in one direction. Maybe Rome didn't fall in a day. Maybe it never really fell. Maybe it was simply rebranded. And reborn in a new form. No longer an empire of soldiers, but an empire of memory. An empire that no longer needed to control territory. Only to control what people remembered about that territory. And if memory can be manipulated, then history is no longer what happened. It is only what we're allowed to remember. Part 2, Controlled Darkness. Who wrote history after 476? When Romulus Augustulus was deposed, the Western world did not simply fall into political silence. It fell into a silence of memory. And in that silence, a hand quietly reached down through the ashes of Roman history, picked up the pen, and began to rewrite the past. It was not a king, not a scholar, not the people. It was the Church. After 476, what remained in Europe were not palaces, but stone monasteries. No more academies like those in Athens or Alexandria. No more public philosophical debates. No more classes in astronomy, medicine, or natural sciences as in the imperial age. All that remained were men in robes, secluded behind cold stone walls, painstakingly copying what they believed to be sacred texts. Those lines, copied and recopied, became the sole pillars of Europe's collective memory. Because no one else was allowed to write anymore, the secular world collapsed. Secular schools were either dissolved or converted into religious ones. Independent scholars were either silenced or erased from the record. Anyone who wished to continue working with knowledge had to kneel before the Church, trading freedom for survival, trading independent thought for the salvation of their soul. Even language was seized. Latin, once the language of Roman law, science, and philosophy, was slowly transformed. What replaced it was ecclesiastical Latin, a grammatically altered form, rich in theological symbolism but poor in practical clarity. It was no longer the language of citizens. It became the language of clerics. A language hard to learn, hard to interpret, but easy to control. When memory is rewritten in a language you cannot understand, you lose your right to question it. A book may hold the truth, but if you cannot read it, then whoever reads it for you becomes the owner of that truth. And for over 500 years, the only ones left who could read, write, and preserve texts were the clergy of the Vatican. Remember this. When you are the only one who can read, you don't need to control the truth. You only need to control who gets access to it. That is what the Vatican did. Not with swords, but with pens. They didn't need to rewrite all of history. They only needed to decide which parts were worth copying, and which were not. From the 6th to the 9th century, nearly all surviving manuscripts were scriptures, lives of saints, church law, religious sermons. No one copied the works of Aristotle, Euclid, or Hippocrates. Except for a few secret versions preserved deep inside monasteries like Monte Cassino or Cluny. Ideas labeled as pagan, worldly, or irrelevant to salvation were simply not recopied. And a text that is never recopied is a text that disappears. Here, we begin to see a subtle but devastating strategy. Censorship not through fire, but through omission. Absence does not raise alarms like destruction does. A map that is never printed will never be missed. A text never read will never be remembered. Language is the key to memory. When memory is rewritten in a language you do not understand, you no longer have the means to resist, because you no longer have the words to ask questions. And so, while the Islamic world glowed with the light of science, while Chinese astronomy advanced, while Indian medicine and mathematics flourished, the West quietly slid into a darkness not born of ignorance, but of controlled knowledge. A darkness not due to the absence of light, but because light was only allowed to shine where permission was granted. That's why we must understand. The fall of Rome wasn't just the collapse of a civilization. It was the transfer of memory's authority. From philosopher to theologian. From courthouse to pulpit. From public libraries to cloistered monasteries. And if history from that moment onward was only written by those with the right to write, then how do we know what was true and what was merely selected? The danger was never that someone made up lies. The danger was that we were left with only one version. A version handwritten, translated, censored, and sealed with divine authority. The Dark Ages may not have been truly dark. But when all light comes from a single flame, you never really know what light looks like. And perhaps, that is the most dangerous kind of darkness. Not the absence of light, but a world where every other light has been extinguished before you even opened your eyes. Part 3, 300 Years Missing, The Legend of Phantom Time. What if I told you, nearly 300 years of European history may never have happened at all? How would you react? It sounds absurd, a joke, a conspiracy, a distortion. After all, how can you add time to history? Time isn't something you can fake, right? But that's exactly what the phantom time hypothesis suggests. And this isn't the wild theory of dreamers or sci-fi fans. It's a hypothesis based on strange historical gaps, uncanny character duplications, and astronomical contradictions that just don't add up. The phantom time hypothesis. First proposed by German historian Herbert Illig in the 1990s, this theory claims that approximately 297 years, between AD 614 and 911, were artificially inserted into history. In simpler terms, instead of living in 2025, we may actually be in the year 1728. 3 centuries, fabricated not by science, but by politics and religious power. Unthinkable? Let's examine the evidence. Strange parallels, Charlemagne and Constantine. According to traditional history, Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814. He was hailed as the unifier of Western Europe, the restorer of Roman culture. But when placed side by side with the biography of Constantine the Great from the 4th century, a pattern emerges. Both unified fragmented empires. Both wielded Christianity to legitimize their rule. Both enacted sweeping legal and administrative reforms. Both were portrayed as near-saintly figures in church-sponsored texts. The similarities go beyond coincidence. Entire passages in medieval chronicles mirror each other, sometimes using identical narrative structures and even phrasing. Some researchers argue that the entire Carolingian dynasty, supposedly founded by Charlemagne, may have been a deliberate copy of earlier Roman templates. The absence of verifiable documents, 614 to 911. Now try this. Ask a historian to provide original, date-verified documentation from the 7th to 10th centuries. Not copies written centuries later. Not church-retouched texts. But living records, letters, court transcripts, royal decrees, artifacts with exact dates. The response? Silence, or fragments vaguely dated by church calendars, not independent markers. Worse still, astronomical inconsistencies arise. Did you know that solar eclipses are infallible historical markers? They can be calculated backwards thousands of years with precision to the minute. The sky doesn't lie. Yet when modern astronomers ran simulations to cross-check eclipses recorded in European texts from the 7th to 9th centuries, the results were chilling. None matched. Some dates claimed to be solar eclipses had clear skies. Others had no celestial events at all. Meanwhile, matching records from China, India, and the Arab world revealed massive timeline mismatches, sometimes off by decades, even centuries. The ancient Egyptians recorded solar eclipses to the minute. The Mayans tracked a 26,000-year solar cycle. But 7th century Europe, filled with monks, monasteries, and liturgical calendars, couldn't write down a single accurate eclipse. Herbert Illig named 3 culprits. 1. Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor. 2. Gerbert of Aurillac, a scholar monk who became Pope Sylvester II. 3. The Vatican. Their motivations? To legitimize power. If Charlemagne had ruled more recently, then Otto III's claim to imperial succession would appear stronger. To fulfill prophecy. If the Church promised Christ would return at the year 1000, they needed to speed up the calendar. To construct a powerful myth. a narrative where Europe had endured a long night of superstition and was saved through faith, a perfect justification for the Church's authority. The problem isn't just a few incorrect dates. The problem is, if time can be manipulated, then every event tied to that time becomes questionable. A king may never have existed. A dynasty could be fiction. A dark century may have never happened. History can be distorted. But time, that's sacred. Unless you control the calendar. And who held the calendar? Not kings. Not generals. The historians. The scribes. The ones who kept the time. The Vatican. To be clear, the phantom time hypothesis remains highly controversial and rejected by mainstream academia. But the gaps in documents, the astronomical mismatches, the suspiciously similar emperors, they're real. The fear isn't whether the theory is true. It's that no one dares to seriously investigate it. Because if it is true, Western chronology must be rewritten. And perhaps that's why silence was chosen. Just like the 300 years of history with no voice, no record. A silence that may be accidental, but could also be the perfect lie. Part 4, Distorted Astronomy, when the sky was forced into silence. The sky doesn't lie. But that doesn't mean humans can't rewrite what the sky is trying to say. Since the beginning of time, the heavens have been humanity's most honest and precise clock. From ancient Egypt and Babylon to the Mayans, every great civilization understood one profound truth. Astronomy is the only method of measuring time that transcends generations and manipulation. The position of the sun, the lunar cycles, the rare conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, and the fleeting moments of total solar eclipses, these cosmic events are unchangeable timestamps etched into the fabric of time. A total solar eclipse, visible only from a specific place at a specific time, can be calculated backward with modern algorithms to an accuracy of less than a second. So, if a document claims there was an eclipse on June 14, 647, over Milan, we can verify it. If no eclipse occurred on that date, that document is false. Or, the historical timeline is wrong. When modern astronomers analyzed European records from the so-called Dark Ages, 6th to 10th centuries, using astronomical software, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Many recorded celestial events never occurred. Meanwhile, accurate eclipse records from China, India, and Persia, described in vivid detail, had no matching counterpart in European sources. Why? Did medieval Europeans not look up at the sky? They did. But they were not allowed to speak about what they saw. History remembers men like Galileo Galilei and Giordano Bruno, those who dared to say, "The Earth is not the center of the universe. The planets orbit the sun. The Milky Way is not the entirety of creation." And the price they paid? Bruno was burned alive in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in 1600. Galileo was forced to recant his discoveries and lived the rest of his life under house arrest. Were they wrong? No. They were simply right at the wrong time. Because some truths, no matter how evident, are not allowed to exist if they threaten the foundation of power. The Vatican had known about the movement of the stars long before the Renaissance. Since the 8th century, many European monasteries maintained lunar solar calendars to calculate the date of Easter, an act requiring precise knowledge of moon phases and equinoxes. In other words, they were always watching the sky. But those records, never made public, never sent to academies, never used to verify civil history. In ancient monasteries, like Monte Cassino, Italy, Corbie, France, and Fulda, Germany, exist hand-copied astronomical manuscripts from the 9th century. They are still under Vatican control. Only select clergy are allowed full access. We know about these documents only through fragments, or through second-hand descriptions by a few scholars granted temporary access. But why keep them hidden? If history is what we've been told, If the timeline is correct, what is there to hide? A power structure may let you look up at the sky, but it won't let you understand what you're seeing. Because once you understand the sky, you'll realize that time is not a gift handed down, but a truth that can be proven. The Vatican's silence on astronomical contradictions is no accident. They know that once people can observe and interpret the heavens for themselves, the truth about time will emerge. And with it, the crumbling of the historical timeline they helped construct. A simple example. In China, royal astronomers recorded a total eclipse on June 10, 840 AD, witnessed from Luoyang, with darkness lasting 4 minutes and 16 seconds. In Europe, nothing. No entry. Despite cities like Frankfurt, Milan, and Cologne lying directly in the eclipse's path. Coincidence? Maybe once. But when the coincidences repeat dozens of times, it stops being random. It becomes a pattern of omission. And the Vatican didn't need to deny the existence of eclipses. They simply had to remain silent. Something that is neither confirmed nor denied will simply be forgotten. For centuries, only monks were taught to track solar cycles, observe Jupiter and Venus, or calculate the appearance of comets. The general population lacked the knowledge, and was forbidden from seeking it. He who controls the calendar, controls memory. For the Vatican, that wasn't a metaphor. It was policy. When we think of censorship, we imagine burning books, sacking libraries, or banning publications. But the most powerful form of censorship is information monopoly. If only one institution keeps the sky's journal, if only one council declares what year it is, then history ceases to be an objective flow of time, and becomes a script. When Galileo was condemned, he is said to have whispered, "And yet, it moves." The Earth continued to orbit the Sun, even if millions were taught otherwise. Because truth does not need the majority. It only needs to survive. Part 5, Ancient Maps and the Words That Were Hidden. When you hold a map in your hands, what do you think you're looking at? Geography? Borders? Roads? No. You're looking at a civilization's perception of the world, and of itself. And here's the strange part. Some maps, drawn hundreds of years before modern measurement tools existed, depict details so precise they could only be confirmed by modern satellite imagery. These maps don't just challenge science. They challenge official history. In 1929, within the Topkapi Palace archives in Istanbul, a forgotten map was discovered. It was drawn on gazelle skin, meticulously detailed and stunningly accurate. Its creator? Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis. Date? 1513, just 21 years after Columbus discovered the Americas. But here's the breathtaking twist. It accurately depicts the coastline of Antarctica. Without ice. Antarctica has been frozen for thousands of years. No one in the 1500s could have seen the continent's subglacial shape. In fact, humanity only confirmed that coastline using ice-penetrating radar in the 20th century. And yet, the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica's ice-free shoreline, with extraordinary precision. How? Piri Reis himself wrote that he didn't draw it from observation. He compiled it from over 20 ancient maps, some dating back to Alexander the Great and ancient Egypt. This implies some unknown civilization, long before recorded history, saw an ice-free Antarctica and mapped it. The questions no one wants to ask. Where did those source maps come from? Who preserved them across thousands of years? And why have we never been taught this? Piri Reis's map is not alone. There are dozens more that defy the timeline. Orontius Phineas map, 1531 depicts the full Antarctic continent, mountains, rivers, and coastlines, matching modern geological data. Bwach map, 1737 shows Antarctica as two separate land masses, which aligns with modern tectonic knowledge. Zeno map, 1380 depicts Greenland ice-free, with inland rivers, confirmed only in the 21st century by satellite imaging. Vinland map, pre-1492 shows land west of the Atlantic, possibly North America, before Columbus ever sailed. Many of these impossible maps share something in common. They were copied or stored by European monks. Several originated from monasteries or libraries tied to the Vatican. Did you know the Vatican holds over 70,000 ancient maps that have never been made public? That's not a guess, it's documented. According to internal reports from the Vatican Library and the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, tens of thousands of maps and geographic records lie in its limestone vaults. Most have never been digitized, nor studied by anyone outside the Church. Why? Because maps don't just show directions. They establish truth. And when that truth contradicts official history, the map must be hidden. Maps don't just tell you where to go. They tell you who you are. And when you don't know where you are, you can be led anywhere. Imagine this. A lost civilization once knew the shape of Antarctica. A map showed the Americas before the Americas were discovered. Islands drawn in old atlases that no longer exist today. Lines of geomagnetic energy connecting ancient sites, Giza, Angkor, Nazca, hinting at a global awareness that should not have existed. And yet, none of this is taught in schools. Not because it's untrue, but because it doesn't fit. Because it forces us to ask. Did humanity once reach a level of advancement, then fall, and the history we know was rewritten from zero? And who would have the power to do that? Not kings. Not empires. But the one institution that controlled knowledge, faith, and libraries across Europe for nearly 1,000 years. The Vatican. During the so-called Dark Ages, it wasn't that light didn't exist. It's that light was locked away. In books. In maps. In the cold stone vaults beneath Rome. Perhaps. We haven't lost our memory. We've simply been misguided. By maps never published. By words never taught. And when you don't know where you are, you no longer steer your own path. You are led by someone else's version of history. Part 6, Reconstructed Moments. Was the Renaissance really the beginning? Imagine a room cloaked in darkness for 1,000 years. No light. No sound. Just silence, deep, unbroken, eternal. And then, suddenly, a light flickers on. Paintings awaken. Architecture rises. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, return as if they had never slept. We call this era the Renaissance. But the question is, was the Renaissance truly a beginning? Or was it merely the next act in a script long prepared? Between the 14th and 16th centuries, Europe seemed to wake from a long dream. Leonardo da Vinci sketched human anatomy with accuracy rivaling modern X-rays. Copernicus placed the sun at the center of the universe. Michelangelo gave marble a soul. Machiavelli wrote about power with startling modern insight. But how does a society that had hibernated for nearly 1,000 years, with no universities, no scientific foundation, no publishing infrastructure, suddenly explode with knowledge? Unless that knowledge wasn't created during the Renaissance, but preserved, hidden, and then reintroduced, strategically. As we revisit original Renaissance documents, one fact emerges. Many classical manuscripts, by Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, weren't discovered during this era. They had already existed quietly, stored away in monasteries and church libraries. At Monte Cassino, handwritten works of Cicero and Vitruvius were preserved for centuries. St. Gall Monastery in Switzerland housed nearly 2,000 manuscripts from before the 9th century. Dozens of Greek works were translated into Latin by church scholars, long before they were ever rediscovered. So why weren't these ideas shared earlier? Perhaps, because they were intentionally withheld, and then selectively released when the time was right. The light of the Renaissance was real. But maybe it wasn't sunlight. Maybe it was a spotlight, turned on by a hidden hand. The Renaissance didn't bloom across all of Europe. It began in specific cities: Florence, Venice, Rome. And in these cities, specific families held the keys to power. The Medici family of Florence sponsored nearly every major Renaissance figure. Pope Leo X, a Medici himself, opened Vatican archives, but only to select scholars. The Church reissued ancient texts through its network of cathedral schools and religious universities. So, was the revival of ancient knowledge truly spontaneous? Or was it part of a strategy? A strategy to reshape the European mind. After a millennium of faith-based information control, the printing press emerged during the Renaissance. But books remained a luxury, mostly written in Latin. A language understood only by clerics and the elite. Schools were opened, but largely operated by the Church. Ideas that strayed too far, whether in science or art, were still censored, subtly or brutally. Giordano Bruno, executed for proposing an infinite universe. Galileo, forced to recant and live under house arrest. Manuscripts confiscated, scholars silenced. The Renaissance offered light with conditions. You could be enlightened, as long as you didn't shine light on forbidden ground. Some modern thinkers refer to the Renaissance as the Great Reboot. Because ancient works weren't rediscovered, they were re-released, copied from older sources. Knowledge was reframed, through church-approved language, contexts, and values. What fit the narrative was called science. What didn't, was labeled heresy. Perhaps the Renaissance wasn't the first light after darkness, but a light deliberately switched on. Once the power structures felt secure enough to design a new world order. A world where the Church still governed morality. The state was modeled after centralized authority. Humanity was enlightened, but only within approved boundaries. Ask yourself, what if that ancient knowledge had never been buried? Where would we be today? If the Greeks mastered mechanics, math, and astronomy, how were their descendants forced to forget? And if knowledge can be turned off and on like a light, then who's standing at the switch? Maybe the Renaissance was a true awakening. But maybe it was only the next chapter of a story already written long ago, by those who held not just power and knowledge, but time itself. Part 7, Lessons Turned into Bells of Silence. Imagine this. You live in a world where schools are not places to ask questions, but places to learn how not to. A world where knowledge is not something to explore, but something to obey. This is not a dystopian future. It is the reality of centuries of European history, when the Church controlled the entire education system. After the fall of the Roman Empire, secular schools disappeared. What remained were monastic schools, built and managed by monasteries, bishops, and the Pope. Who was allowed to learn? Only the children of nobility or those chosen by the Church. What was taught? The Bible, ecclesiastical Latin, papal law. What was forbidden? Natural sciences, classical Greek philosophy, anything that contradicted church doctrine. Knowledge became a privilege. But a privilege not to seek truth, only to serve power. Anyone who dared ask questions beyond church teaching was punished. Galileo Galilei, forced to recant his heliocentric theory, despite proving it through telescopic evidence. Giordano Bruno, burned alive for saying the universe was infinite, and that other planets might host life. Michael Servetus, executed for rejecting the Trinity, though he was a pioneering scientist in blood circulation. Roger Bacon, banned from teaching for his work in optics and chemistry. William of Ockham, excommunicated for daring to say the Pope was not infallible. An unspoken rule took hold. Critical thinking was a sin. Doubt was heresy. And silence was survival. The church didn't just control books. It controlled the very language of knowledge. Only texts written in ecclesiastical Latin were allowed to be taught. Books in native languages were banned, burned, or restricted. Translations of the Bible into German, French, or English were labeled heretical. You could spend your entire life in the church and never once be allowed to read the Bible in your own tongue. This system lasted for nearly 1,000 years. That means dozens of generations were educated under a model not designed to enlighten, but to assimilate. They weren't taught how to think. They were taught how to repeat belief. You don't need to understand the world. You only need to know who made it. And obey. Ignorance is not dangerous. Institutionalized ignorance is. Why were the brightest minds treated as enemies? The church didn't fear what they taught. It feared their ability to inspire free thought. Because once a person dares to ask, why? They eventually ask, who wrote this law? Who controls the truth? And why am I not allowed to know? And for that, they were silenced. Not with reason, but with fire, fear, and inquisitorial courts. There is something that still lingers in modern education. Something we've rarely questioned. Who decides what's mandatory? Who selects the core values? And who has the power to erase a chapter of history? If you believe today's classrooms are free, remember, they are built on the foundations of centuries of control. And that foundation was never truly dismantled. It was merely renamed. History isn't only erased by war or book burnings. It is distorted when we are taught only a sanctioned script. And education, without the freedom of thought, is nothing more than a decorated prison made of books. A lesson can open the light, but it can also be the bell of silence, ringing not to awaken thought, but to signal its end. A new era begins the moment we know only what they allow us to know. Part 8, The Vatican and the Archive with no key. If you believe that truth always finds a way to rise, remember, there are places where the truth is preserved so well, it never gets the chance to be revealed. One such place lies deep beneath the Vatican. Not in the cathedrals. Not in sermons. But in the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. The Vatican's secret archive. At first glance, the idea that the Vatican preserves over 1.5 million ancient documents might seem noble. From handwritten texts of the 8th century, to diplomatic letters from the Napoleonic era, to Inquisition trial records, and lists of texts removed from the Bible. It's all there. But here's what's strange. Not even the Pope is allowed full access. Even the carefully approved scholars are only granted access to extremely limited sections, after enduring a months-long request process, and must specify exact lines and paragraphs they wish to view. Exploring beyond those lines is strictly forbidden. One of the archive's greatest mysteries lies in the texts excluded from the official Bible, many of which are stored within. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of Jesus' sayings, deeply meditative and Gnostic in tone. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, portraying Mary not just as a follower, but as someone who deeply grasped the spiritual essence of Christ. The Book of Enoch, describing the fall of angels, the Nephilim, and beings born of the sons of heaven. Why were these texts removed? Because they didn't reinforce the power structure of the church. Their omission wasn't solely due to heresy, but out of fear. Fear of losing control over the narrative. If people knew that there were once multiple perspectives on Christ, on the soul, salvation, and divine truth, they'd no longer depend on a single version of belief. This archive isn't a library. It's a vault of humanity's collective memory. Locked away behind bureaucratic gates, theological filters, and an unspoken warning. This is not for you. You could spend your entire life as a theologian, and never lay eyes on a single page about the Knights Templar, medieval alchemical manuscripts, or the original notes from the Council of Nicaea, the meeting that decided who is Christ. One hypothesis suggests that inside this archive lies not just history, but the very mechanism of belief. If you found ancient documents that contradicted current dogma, if you uncovered prophecies that align eerily with today's world, if you traced the evolution of faith through dozens of lost versions, then the monolithic system of belief would begin to crumble. In that system, truth is not light. Truth is a threat. For centuries, the Vatican shaped history through what it called official records. Every copy, every translation, every interpretation, filtered through church doctrine, preserving the original manuscripts but never releasing them, is not just secrecy. It's memory control. They don't need to rewrite the past. They simply need to stay silent about the parts they don't want you to remember. And no one questions what they've never been told existed. You don't need to burn books. Just lock them in a room no one can enter. The effect is the same. We live in a world flooded with data. It's easy to believe nothing can be hidden anymore. But information doesn't have to be deleted to be forgotten. It only has to be kept out of public hands. You don't even need to know it exists. As long as the gatekeeper knows one thing, you'll never walk through that door. If history is a book, the Vatican holds the folded pages. And within those drawers of the secret archive, there may lie lines of text that, if spoken aloud, could not only challenge your beliefs, but rewrite an entire millennium we've been taught to call the Dark Ages. Maybe the Dark Ages didn't happen the way we were told. Or worse, maybe they happened exactly that way, and were buried so deeply, no one dares to dig them up again. Part 9, the story written by those allowed to tell it. What do we believe about the Middle Ages? A Europe swallowed by famine, plague, and endless war. A time when people lived in ignorance, superstition, and fear. A so-called Dark Age, where the light of knowledge disappeared, only to be rescued by the Renaissance and modern science. But what if I told you that image didn't come from the people who lived through it, but was constructed centuries later, in the 19th century? And what if the so-called darkness of the Dark Ages wasn't darkness at all, but a narrative reshaped by those who had the power to rewrite collective memory? Starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, Western scholars, especially in Germany, France, and Britain, began restructuring Europe's historical timeline. They divided history into ancient, medieval, and modern periods. And in that structure, the Middle Ages were branded as an era of ignorance, superstition, and decline. Why? Because it served the ideology of progress. To prove that modern times were the peak of civilization, they needed an opposite. A low point to rise above. From textbooks to films, video games to documentaries, a single image of the Middle Ages was frozen in place. Filthy peasants in ruined villages. Corrupt nobles, tyrannical priests, witches burned alive. Bleak castles, plagues, bloodshed, endless war. And somewhere in the background, the Vatican, depicted either as a victim of secular violence, or the last flicker of divine light. This is the psychology of narrative control. If you can't hide the truth, distract from it with a better story. For centuries, the Church was the center of learning, controlling schools, books, and language. But by the 19th century, as the narrative of a Dark Age took root, the Church's image was quietly rebranded. From censor of thought to misunderstood guardian of metaphysical wisdom. From the institution that burned Bruno to the keeper of spiritual light. From those who silenced Galileo to the moral foundation amid intellectual chaos. They weren't erased from history. They were relocated. The Renaissance didn't happen by accident. It arrived precisely when it was needed. With long-lost manuscripts suddenly rediscovered. And ancient philosophy and art miraculously reborn. So the real question is, who controlled the timing? Who held those manuscripts for centuries, then chose to release them? Who drew the line between the age of darkness and the return of the light? History is light, but that light can be dimmed, hidden, or spotlighted, depending on who holds the switch. Repeat the story of darkness long enough, and people will forget they once lived in the light. Just tell one version. Repeat it enough times. Bury the alternatives deep enough. And eventually, all others vanish from memory. During the so-called Dark Ages, Gothic architecture flourished, geometrically complex, structurally elegant. Mechanical clocks, windmills, and glass-making techniques were invented. Universities like Bologna, Oxford, and Paris emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries. Epic poetry, sacred music, and scholastic philosophy thrived. Yet these are rarely celebrated as achievements. Because they don't fit the narrative of a time supposedly steeped in backwardness. Is not the history of truth. It's the history told by those who had the right to tell it. When only a few people can write books, teach classes, produce films. You'll never know if the story you believe is true. You only know it's the only one you've ever been allowed to hear. And one day, without realizing it, you'll become a storyteller yourself. Repeating it faithfully, reverently, completely. As if you had seen it with your own eyes. But maybe it was never your story to tell. We often think of history as a linear sequence of events. We call it what really happened. But what if that reality is merely the version we've been allowed to remember? Then is the present we live in truly real? Or is it just the outcome of a carefully curated past? An empire can collapse in silence. 1,000 years can pass without a single recorded eclipse. An entire body of knowledge can be locked away beneath the Vatican. And called sacred preservation. But here's the truth. History doesn't have to be erased. It only needs to be told from one perspective. Together, we've journeyed through a vanished empire with no farewell. A dark age that may not have been so blind. Maps, stars, scriptures, and records, all rewritten. Doors locked not with chains, but with fear and faith. So if the past was once rewritten, how objective is the present? And if the present is built upon a past already manipulated, how much freedom do we truly have in shaping the future? We don't need to be archaeologists. We don't need to break into the Vatican. We don't need to prove whether the year 614 actually happened. We just need to ask, why were we taught only one version of history? Who decided what deserved to be remembered? How do we tell real light from artificial illumination? Because intellectual freedom begins with doubt. We live in the age of information. Everything can be searched, analyzed, verified. And yet, an unbiased memory may be harder to access than ever. In a world where every post is quietly filtered, every algorithm favors what's popular, and every truth must carry the seal of some approved institution, then questioning is no longer rebellion. It's survival. You can continue living under a light timed and triggered by others. Or, you can learn to find the switch for yourself. Not to change the world, but to ensure you aren't changed by a world written in advance. Maybe the Dark Ages weren't a specific time period, but a state of mind. One where we lose the right to understand ourselves. And if that's the case, the only way to avoid repeating the mistakes of history is to refuse to accept history blindly. You don't need to believe every conspiracy, but you must question anything too perfect to be true. The future will not be written by the most powerful, but by those courageous enough to look back at the past honestly. And if you've stayed with me until this very moment, then maybe you are one of those people.